at exactly 2:23 in the morning. Deep inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Abraham Lincoln, a radar operator leaned forward in his chair, squinted at his screen, and said 4 words that would freeze the entire room. "Sir, we have contacts. The Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, the most strategically critical waterway on the surface of the planet. Every single day, roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through these dark, narrow waters. And on this particular night, a night with no moon, a sky thick with humid haze, and visibility barely past 3 nautical miles, the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group had entered the strait on a routine transit toward the Arabian Sea. Routine. That word would not last long. 3 blips appeared on the AN/SPS-49 radar display. Not merchant vessels, not fishing boats. The signatures were military, fast, purposeful, and they were moving in a formation that any trained naval officer would immediately recognize. They weren't converging from one direction. They were spreading, deliberately, like fingers closing around a fist. One contact was approaching from the north, one from the south, and one, alarmingly, was already ahead of the carrier's projected course, slowing down as if waiting. The Combat Information Center, the CIC, erupted with controlled intensity. Voices overlapped in disciplined urgency. Radio channels crackled to life. The tactical action officer reached for his headset. The admiral's quarters were called, and somewhere in the vast network of the strike group, the 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers received the same tactical picture on their own displays and began, quietly, repositioning. But here is what the crew of the Abraham Lincoln didn't know yet. These 3 warships had been tracking the carrier for over 6 hours, in total silence, without a single radio transmission that American sensors had detected. They had been patient, disciplined, and extraordinarily precise. Whatever this was, it had been planned, and it was just beginning. To understand why this moment was so dangerous, why experienced naval officers felt a chill in a room that was already climate-controlled at 68 degrees, you have to understand what an aircraft carrier truly is at sea. The USS Abraham Lincoln is not just a ship. She is a floating city of war. At over 1,000 feet long, displacing over 100,000 tons of water, she carries up to 90 fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters on her flight deck. Her crew numbers nearly 5,000 souls. She is powered by 2 nuclear reactors that will never need refueling for the life of the ship. She represents the single most expensive and complex weapons platform that human civilization has ever produced. And yet, for all of her staggering power, she has a fundamental vulnerability. Aircraft carriers do not fight alone. They cannot fight alone. An aircraft carrier without her escorts is, at her core, a massive, slow-turning target. Her survivability depends entirely on the layered defensive shield built around her by the rest of the strike group. Destroyers, submarines, cruisers, electronic warfare systems, combat air patrols launched around the clock. Remove that shield, or worse, confuse it, and the equation changes dramatically. 3 warships, closing from 3 different vectors. That was the calculation someone had made. Back in the CIC, the identification process was already underway. The AN/SPS-49 radar was painting the contacts with increasing clarity. The electronic warfare suite was scanning for emissions, radar signals, communications frequencies, fire control signatures, anything that would reveal exactly who these ships were and what they were carrying. And simultaneously, one of the Lincoln's F/A-18 Super Hornets, already on combat air patrol 20,000 feet overhead, received new coordinates and banked hard into a descent to investigate. The first answer came within 4 minutes. Iran, the southern contact was identified as an Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy fast attack craft. Not one of Iran's larger frigates, but a smaller, missile-armed vessel capable of speeds exceeding 40 knots. The IRGC Navy had a well-documented history of aggressive behavior in these exact waters. Fast, unpredictable, willing to escalate in ways that conventional navies sometimes would not. The second contact, approaching from the north, was larger, significantly larger. It was a Corvette-class warship, heavier armed, carrying what analysts believed were anti-ship cruise missiles. The emissions profile suggested its fire control radar was active, meaning it was not merely watching. It was in a targeting posture. When the third contact, and the one sitting ahead of the carrier's course like a gate left deliberately ajar, still had not been fully identified. Its radar signature was unlike the other two. Different nation, different design philosophy, which meant this was not simply an Iranian operation. This was coordinated, multi-actor, and that changed everything. Within 7 minutes of the initial contact report, the Abraham Lincoln's captain had authorized a course change. The carrier began a slow, ponderous turn to port, a 30,000-ton pivot that at sea looks almost graceful, but inside the ship feels like the world tilting on its axis. At the same time, the strike group's guided missile destroyer USS Gravely accelerated to flank speed and moved to interpose herself between the southern IRGC vessel and the carrier. This is naval doctrine. You protect the carrier always, at any cost. But what nobody in the strike group had anticipated was what happened next. The three contacts did not retreat when they detected the carrier's course change. They adapted. The northern corvette increased speed. The IRGC fast attack craft altered its own heading, maintaining its intercept geometry with an almost eerie precision, as if it had predicted the course change before it happened. And the third contact, the mystery ship ahead, it turned on its active radar, a powerful, full-spectrum sweep that lit up every sensor aboard the Abraham Lincoln like a floodlight. It was a signal, not an accident, a signal. They're telling us they see everything, the electronic warfare officer said almost to himself. And then, the radio came alive. The transmission was in Farsi, then repeated in accented but clear English. The message was short, barely 12 seconds long. But those 12 seconds were enough to cause the tactical action officer to look up from his console, meet the admiral's eyes across the darkened room, and say nothing at all. Because the words didn't require interpretation. They were a warning. A declaration that these waters were considered sovereign, that the carrier's passage was not welcome, that the three vessels would maintain their current positions, and that any attempt to proceed on the original course would be considered an act of aggression. 12 seconds. And the entire complexion of the situation had just transformed from a tense interception into a potential international incident. Now think about what the Admiral is facing in this moment. Why, he has a 100,000-ton warship in the narrowest part of the Strait of Hormuz. He has 3 hostile, or at minimum aggressively positioned, warships closing on him from 3 directions. He has a fire control radar locked on his vessel from one of those contacts. He has 5,000 crew members depending on the decisions he makes in the next 60 seconds. And he has one very specific problem that every carrier group commander lives with, practices for, and dreads in equal measure. The Strait of Hormuz is not open ocean. He cannot simply accelerate away. He cannot easily outrun the threat. The geography of the strait, the shallow water, the tanker traffic, the Iranian-controlled coastline barely 10 miles to the north, constrains his options in ways that an adversary can exploit with extraordinary precision. Someone had planned this down to the geography. Back in Washington, though it was late afternoon on the East Coast. The National Military Command Center had already been notified. Satellite feeds were being pulled. SIGINT analysts were processing the intercepts. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs was being briefed. And somewhere in the labyrinthine corridors of decision-making that govern American military responses, a very careful calculation was being made. Could this be a miscalculation, a show of force that had no intention of actual engagement? Iranian forces, particularly the IRGC Navy, had a long history of provocative behavior in the Gulf, from swarming fast boat exercises near American warships to the seizure of sailors who had strayed into disputed waters. But this was different. The coordination, the multi-actor nature of it. The pre-positioning that had gone undetected for 6 hours. This had the hallmarks of something more deliberate. And this was the darker possibility that nobody wanted to say aloud. Was it designed to provoke a response? A response that could be framed, internationally, as American aggression? The first shot in a narrative rather than a war? The Admiral made his decision in 90 seconds. He would not fire. He would not retreat. He would not yield the strait. But he would make absolutely certain that every warship approaching his carrier understood, with crystal clarity, exactly what they were approaching. The order went out simultaneously to 3 components of the strike group, and the USS Gravely and USS Michael Mansour, both Arleigh Burke Flight 3 destroyers, carrying the most advanced version of the Aegis combat system ever deployed, began painting the incoming vessels with their own fire control radars. Full power, unmistakable. A technological declaration that said, "We see you, we have solutions on you, and we are ready." From the flight deck of the Abraham Lincoln, 2 FA-18E Super Hornets that had been waiting on the catapult, engines running, pilots strapped in, were launched into the darkness within 4 minutes of the order. Not toward the warships. Not yet. They were sent to orbit overhead at 15,000 feet, their sensors recording everything, their presence visible on every radar screen in a 50-mile radius. And from somewhere beneath the black water, somewhere that no surface radar could see, somewhere that no fire control system had a solution on, the USS Indiana, a Virginia-class attack submarine that had been traveling in the strike group's company for 3 days without surfacing, received a single encrypted message and silently altered course, moving toward the IRGC fast attack craft, slowly, invisibly, a ghost, drawing closer in the dark. This is the weapon that surface warships fear most, not the destroyer they can see on radar. Not the fighter jet screaming overhead at 400 knots. The submarine. The one you never know is there until it's already too late. And the warships closing on the Abraham Lincoln had no idea. 11 minutes after the initial radio transmission, a second message was broadcast, this time not by the unidentified vessels, but by USS Gravely. In Farsi and English, the destroyer's crew transmitted a response that had been drafted by naval legal officers, cleared by the Admiral, and transmitted with exact, deliberate language. The Strait of Hormuz, it stated, is an international waterway. The USS Abraham Lincoln Strike Group was conducting lawful transit passage in full accordance with international maritime law. Any interference with that passage would be considered a hostile act. Any illumination with fire control radar was noted and logged, and the strike group had the full right and capability to defend itself. Then the transmission ended. 7 seconds of silence on the radio frequency. Then, the fire control radar from the northern corvette switched off. Just like that. The targeting signal disappeared, 1 down, but the other 2 vessels were still moving. The IRGC fast attack craft from the south had closed to within 8 nautical miles of the carrier's current position. 8 miles is nothing at sea. For a ship carrying C-802 anti-ship missiles, subsonic, sea-skimming, radar-guided, 8 nautical miles is well within effective firing range. The USS Gravely, now positioned between the craft and the carrier, was tracking it with everything she had. The Aegis system had a fire solution. The standard missile batteries were hot. All it needed was a command. Nobody gave that command. Instead, the Admiral authorized the use of a capability that most people watching this have never heard of. The aircraft carrier and her escorts carry, among their electronic warfare systems, a suite of active jamming and deception technology. Without going into classified specifics, these systems can, under certain conditions, create false radar returns, distort targeting solutions, and make a warship appear to be somewhere it is not. They can, in essence, make a carrier temporarily invisible to a radar that doesn't know what it's looking for. The systems were activated on the radar screens aboard the IRGC fast attack craft, and potentially on the screens of the Northern Corvette and the Mystery Third vessel. The Abraham Lincoln's return began to fade, shift, and multiply. Where there had been one clear radar signature, there were suddenly 3, then 5, moving in different directions, at different speeds. The digital ghost of a carrier projected across the electromagnetic spectrum like a magician's misdirection. The IRGC vessel slowed. Its radar swept back and forth. It had lost the target. 40 seconds passed, then a minute, then 2 minutes. In those 2 minutes, the USS Abraham Lincoln increased to flank speed, 26 knots, the fastest she would move that night, and drove northeast, pushing through the deeper channel of the strait, her escorts reforming around her in a tighter defensive screen. The 2 Super Hornets overhead dropped altitude and swept once, low and loud, across the path of the unidentified third vessel, a thundering declaration of presence that needed no translation. And then something no one had predicted happened. The third vessel. The mystery contact that had started this entire confrontation. The ship that had positioned itself ahead of the carrier's course like a locked gate. It turned and it ran. Not slowly, not in a measured withdrawal. It ran at maximum speed, heading northeast, away from the strait, toward territorial waters that it apparently believed would provide some form of protection. In doing so, it revealed its identity to the sensors now tracking it with total clarity. It was not Iranian. Its radar signature matched a vessel class operated by a nation whose involvement in this scenario carried implications that went far beyond the Strait of Hormuz. Implications that would quietly alarm every intelligence analyst who reviewed the data in the hours and days that followed. But that story, the full story of who sent that third ship and why, is one that has never been officially confirmed. The navies involved have said nothing. The governments involved have said nothing. What happened in those dark waters that night lives in encrypted after-action reports and intelligence assessments that will likely remain classified for decades. What is known is this. By 4:47 a.m., the USS Abraham Lincoln and her strike group had cleared the Strait of Hormuz and entered the open water of the Arabian Sea. The 3 vessels that had surrounded her had dispersed. No shots had been fired. No missiles launched. No sailors harmed. To the outside world, to the shipping lanes full of oil tankers, to the fishing boats riding at anchor near the Iranian coast, to the commercial satellites passing overhead on their morning orbits, nothing had happened. Nothing at all. And that is perhaps the most remarkable part of this entire story. Because what had actually happened, what had unfolded in the span of roughly 2.5 hours in the narrow darkness of the Strait of Hormuz, was a masterclass in the kind of warfare that doesn't make headlines. The kind of warfare that is fought not with explosions and casualties, but with information, positioning, electronic dominance, and the disciplined refusal to be provoked. The 3 warships had attempted something genuinely audacious. They had tried to box in the most powerful warship on Earth to use geography and numbers and the threat of violence to force an outcome, a course change, a retreat, a confrontation that would have handed them a victory without a shot being fired. They failed. Not because American weapons were superior, though they were. Not because American technology was more capable, though it was. They failed because the men and women aboard the Abraham Lincoln and her escorts had trained for exactly this scenario, had practiced it in war games and simulations and fleet exercises, and when the moment came, they executed with a precision that left the adversary with no good options. But here is the question that stays with you long after the radar screens go dark. 3 warships, 3 different approach vectors, 6 hours of silent tracking before the confrontation began. A radio message that had clearly been scripted in advance. And that third vessel, the one whose identity was never publicly confirmed, running at full speed the moment American aircraft dropped low overhead. Who planned this? Who gave the order? Who coordinated 3 vessels from what appears to have been at least 2 different nations into a synchronized operation in the world's most watched waterway on a night chosen specifically for its darkness and haze? And what was the actual goal? Was it a probe? A test of American response times, electronic warfare capabilities, and decision-making under pressure? Was it an attempt to generate an incident that could be exploited politically? Or was it something even more calculated? A rehearsal for something larger, something yet to come? The sailors aboard the Abraham Lincoln went back to their duties as the sun came up over the Arabian Sea. Flight operations resumed. The mess hall served breakfast. The engineering crews ran their standard checks on the nuclear reactors humming deep in the ship's hull. Life aboard a carrier normalizes with remarkable speed. It has to. There is always another mission, another transit, another stretch of contested water on the horizon. But somewhere in the bowels of the ship, in a room with no windows and very tight access restrictions, the intelligence officers were still at their consoles, still replaying the radar tracks, still analyzing the radio intercepts, still trying to answer the question that the night had posed without answering. Because in modern naval warfare, in the gray zone between peace and open conflict where most of the real competition happens, the most important battles are often the ones nobody reports. The confrontations that end without casualties are sometimes the most significant. They reveal doctrine. They test responses. They expose capabilities and gaps. They happen in darkness, in silence, in waters that most people will never see, conducted by professionals who will never discuss what they witnessed. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide. On a clear day, you can almost see from one shore to the other. It is a place where history has been made quietly, repeatedly, for decades, where the balance of power in the most volatile region on Earth is tested not in boardrooms or summits, but in the dark, on radar screens, in the silences between radio transmissions. On this particular night, 3 warships tried to change that balance. One carrier and the 5,000 souls aboard her held the line. And tomorrow, somewhere out there, in another stretch of water, in another narrow and contested strait, it will happen again. Because this is the world we live in. A world of gray zones and standoffs, of forces that never officially collide but circle each other endlessly in the dark. Each one testing, each one probing, each one asking the same quiet and dangerous question. How far will you go? The answer, on this night, was given not in words, but in the steady pulse of an Aegis radar, the low roar of 2 Super Hornets banking through the haze, and the silent, invisible presence of a Virginia-class submarine moving through the deep water below, unseen, patient, and absolute. How far will you go? The Abraham Lincoln's response was simple, unambiguous. and delivered in the only language that truly matters at 21 miles wide and 2 in the morning, all the way.